You didn't just forget these anime. You were never meant to remember them. What Happened to the Mecha shows that vanished between giants like Mobile Suit Gundam and Super Dimension Fortress Macross. Entire worlds erased, stories buried, and machines that once defined a generation gone without a trace. Today, we're digging them back up. Because some of these weren't failures. They were too strange, too bold, or too ahead of their time. And one of them? It disappeared for a reason. Dancouga, 1985. It didn't start strong. And that's exactly why most people abandoned it. Dancouga opened like just another combining robot show. Formulaic, predictable, almost forgettable. But then, something shifted. The tone darkened. The battles stopped feeling heroic and started feeling desperate. Characters didn't just fight. They struggled, hesitated, and broke under pressure. What made Dancouga different wasn't its animation or even its robot design. It was the way it slowly transformed into something heavier than expected. It wasn't trying to be the next Mobile Suit Gundam, but by leaning into its own gritty identity, it became something far more unpredictable. And that unpredictability is what likely hurt it. Audiences at the time weren't ready for a show that didn't clearly define itself. It felt inconsistent, uncertain. But looking back now, that's exactly what makes it fascinating. It's not polished. It's not clean. It's a series caught between two eras, super robot spectacle and real robot realism. And in that tension, it created something quietly unforgettable, even if most people never stayed long enough to notice. Galvion, 1984. At first glance, Galvion looks like style over substance. Sleek machines, flashy transformations, a world that feels built more for aesthetics than depth. But underneath that surface is something far more unusual. This isn't a clean-cut war story. It's chaotic, messy, almost unstable. Characters act unpredictably, motivations shift, and the narrative doesn't always give you the comfort of clear direction. That's what made it difficult to follow and easy to forget. But that same unpredictability is what gives Galvion its identity. It doesn't feel manufactured, it feels alive, like it's constantly trying to reinvent itself mid-run. Compared to the structured storytelling of Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Galvion feels like a risk that never fully paid off, and maybe that's why it disappeared. Not because it failed completely, but because it refused to settle into something safe. Today, it stands as a reminder of how experimental the 1980s Mecha era really was. Not everything was designed to succeed. Some shows were just trying something different. And sometimes that's enough to be remembered even if only by a few. Machine Robo, Revenge of Kronos, 1986. There's a reason this one feels strangely familiar, even if you've never actually watched it. Machine Robo carried the DNA of toy-driven storytelling, fast-paced, action-heavy, and designed to sell something bigger than the narrative itself. But buried inside that commercial shell is a surprisingly intense core. The story isn't just about battles, it's about exile, revenge, and identity. Rom Stoll's journey isn't light. It's filled with loss, with responsibility forced onto him before he's ready. And that weight gives the series an emotional edge most viewers didn't expect. The problem? It came wrapped in something that looked disposable. At a time when shows like Armored Trooper Votoms were pushing grounded realism, Machine Robo felt like it belonged to an earlier mindset. So, it got overlooked, dismissed. But that dismissal hides something important, because beneath the marketing, this was a story trying to say more than it was allowed to. And if you look closely, you can still see it pushing through. Metal Armor, Dragonar, 1987. It was labeled a Gundam clone almost immediately, and that label never left. Dragonar had the misfortune of arriving at a time when comparisons were inevitable. Military conflict, young pilots, advanced machines, it all felt too familiar. But that surface similarity hides a very different experience. Where Mobile Suit Gundam leaned into tragedy and political complexity, Dragonar introduced something lighter, more character-driven, There's humor here, camaraderie, moments of warmth that break through the tension. And for some viewers, that made it feel less serious, less important. But that balance is exactly what gives it its identity. It's not trying to outdo Gundam. It's trying to make the experience more accessible, more human. And in doing so, it quietly built a tone that many modern mecha shows would later adopt. The tragedy is that it was never given the space to stand on its own. It was always compared, never truly seen. And because of that, it faded into the background despite doing something subtly different. Blue Comet SPT Layzner, 1985. It begins with invasion, but what follows is far more unsettling. Layzner isn't just about war, it's about displacement, about being caught between worlds that no longer trust you. The protagonist isn't a hero in the traditional sense, he's an outsider, a bridge between enemy and ally, never fully accepted by either. And that tension runs through every moment of the series. What makes Layzner stand out is its atmosphere. There's a constant sense of unease, like something is always about to go wrong. Even during quieter scenes, there's pressure beneath the surface. It's not comfortable to watch, and that discomfort is intentional. Compared to more straightforward narratives of the time, this felt heavier, more introspective. And when production issues forced changes later on, that fragile balance was disrupted. The story lost its rhythm, and audiences drifted away. But the core of Layzner still remains powerful. Because it wasn't just telling a war story. It was exploring what it feels like to not belong anywhere, and that's a theme that never really fades. Genesis Climber Mospeada, 1983. It starts with a return, and immediately strips that return of meaning. Earth is no longer home. It's occupied, altered, almost unrecognizable, and that quiet realization, more than any battle, is what defines Mospeada. This isn't a story about winning a war. It's about moving through a world that's already been lost. The armor, the bikes that transform into sleek combat suits, the fluid movement between speed and survival, they give the show a visual identity that feels ahead of its time. But what lingers isn't the design. It's the tone. There's a constant sense of distance between the characters and the world around them, like they're visitors in a place they should belong to. Compared to more triumphant narratives of the era, this felt subdued, almost melancholic. And that's likely why it didn't connect the way it should have. It didn't offer clear victories. It didn't reward viewers with simple resolution. Instead, it asked them to sit with uncertainty, to watch characters who keep moving forward without ever feeling secure. Later, its adaptation into Robotech reshaped how it was remembered, blending it into something else entirely. But the original version carries a quieter, more introspective identity, one that feels less like a spectacle and more like a slow, uneasy journey through a world that no longer feels like home. Panzer World, Galient, 1984. At first, it doesn't even feel like mecha. It feels like fantasy swords, kingdoms, landscapes that stretch into myth rather than machinery. And that's the trap. Because buried inside that medieval world is something mechanical, something ancient, waiting to be awakened. Galient blends genres in a way that feels almost accidental, like two completely different stories were forced to coexist. But instead of collapsing, it creates a strange, compelling tension. The robot isn't just a weapon, it's a relic, a symbol of something forgotten, and when it moves, it doesn't feel triumphant, it feels disruptive. Like it doesn't belong in that world any more than the people who control it fully understand it. That contrast between myth and machine is what makes Galient so distinct. But it's also what made it difficult to categorize. It wasn't pure fantasy, it wasn't traditional mecha. And in a decade where audiences often gravitated toward clearer identities, that ambiguity worked against it. It slipped through the cracks, not because it lacked vision, but because it refused to simplify itself. Today, that same refusal feels like its greatest strength. It doesn't fit neatly anywhere, and that's exactly why it still stands out. Video Warrior Laserion, 1984. It predicted something, and almost no one noticed. Laserion takes a concept that feels completely ordinary, now entering a digital world, and builds an entire mecha narrative around it. But in the mid-80s, that idea wasn't familiar. It was abstract, hard to fully grasp. The battles don't just happen in physical space, they happen inside systems, inside something that feels less real but no less dangerous. And that shift changes everything. The rules aren't stable. Reality itself feels flexible. For viewers expecting grounded conflict, this felt disorienting, almost confusing. But that disorientation is exactly what gives Laserion its edge. It wasn't just telling a story about machines, it was exploring how technology changes the nature of conflict itself. Long before virtual spaces became a common setting, this series was already experimenting with them. And because it arrived too early, it didn't resonate the way it should have. It didn't have the cultural context to support it, so it faded, quietly. But looking back now, it feels less like a forgotten show and more like a prototype. A glimpse of where storytelling was eventually heading, hidden in a time that wasn't ready to understand it. Demon God Incarnation, Shurato, 1989. It looks like fantasy. It feels like mythology. And yet beneath all of that is a structure that echoes Mecha in a way that's easy to miss. Shurato doesn't rely on traditional robots. Instead, it builds its identity around armored transformations, spiritual power, and battles that mirror the intensity of mechanical warfare. The result is something that sits just outside the genre, close enough to belong, but different enough to be overlooked. What makes it compelling is its scale. The conflicts aren't just physical, they're philosophical. Loyalty, betrayal, destiny, these ideas aren't background elements. They drive everything. And as the story unfolds, the lines between ally and enemy blur in ways that feel almost unsettling. It doesn't offer easy answers, it doesn't resolve tension cleanly. Compared to more straightforward mecha narratives, this felt heavier, more abstract. And that abstraction made it harder to follow for audiences expecting something simpler. But that complexity is exactly what gives Shurato its lasting impact. It doesn't just tell a story, it builds a world that feels layered, symbolic, and emotionally charged. And even though it sits on the edge of the genre, its influence quietly echoes through many series that came after it. Special Armored Battalion, Dorvack, 1983. It tried to ground everything, and in doing so, it lost the audience it was aiming for. Dorvack leans into military structure units, tactics, discipline. The machines don't feel mythical or exaggerated. They feel functional, designed for purpose rather than spectacle, and that realism sets the tone immediately. This isn't about heroic pilots saving the day. It's about coordinated effort, about systems working together under pressure. But that same grounded approach made it harder to connect with. Without larger-than-life personalities or dramatic transformations, the series feels restrained, almost distant. Compared to more dynamic shows of the time, it lacked that immediate hook. It asked for patience, for attention to detail, and not everyone was willing to give it. As a result, it slipped into obscurity, remembered more for its mechanical designs than its story. But there's something quietly impressive about what it attempted. It treated its world seriously. It respected the idea of conflict as something complex, not just visually exciting. And in that seriousness, it created a tone that feels closer to modern interpretations of the genre. It may not have captured attention then, but now, it feels like something audiences would understand far more clearly. Heavy Metal, L-Gaim, 1984. It doesn't feel like a typical mecha show, and that's the first sign something is different. L-Gaim exists in a world that feels almost theatrical. Bright designs, unusual character expressions, and a tone that shifts between playful and serious without warning. At first, that contrast can feel jarring. One moment, you're watching lighthearted banter. The next, you're pulled into political conflict and rebellion. And instead of clashing, those tones slowly begin to merge. What makes L-Gaim stand out isn't just its aesthetic, it's the way it builds its world. There's a sense of structure beneath everything. Power isn't random. It's organized, layered, controlled. And the characters aren't simply reacting, they're navigating a system that feels larger than them. That's where the series gains weight. Beneath the color and charm is a narrative about control, resistance, and identity. But at the time, that complexity was easy to overlook. The visuals made it seem lighter than it really was. And audiences expecting something more straightforward didn't always stay long enough to see what it was building toward. Compared to darker, more immediately serious shows, L-Gaim felt inconsistent. But looking back, that inconsistency feels intentional. It creates a rhythm that keeps the viewer slightly off balance, never fully comfortable, never fully certain. And in that uncertainty, it quietly delivers one of the more layered mecha experiences of the decade, hidden behind a surface that almost dares you to underestimate it. Armored Trooper Votoms, 1983. It doesn't open with spectacle, it opens with silence, and a man who barely speaks. Votoms strips the genre down to its core and removes almost everything that once defined it. No heroic speeches. No dramatic transformations, just metal, weight, and survival. The machines aren't majestic, they're disposable. Tools used, damaged, replaced. And that changes how every battle feels. There's no glory here, only consequence. The protagonist, Chiriko, isn't driven by ideals. He's driven by instinct. By the need to survive in a world that has already decided his place. And that world feels cold, unforgiving, structured in a way that doesn't care about individuals. That's what makes Votoms so different. It doesn't ask you to admire its characters, it asks you to understand them, to sit with their choices, even when those choices feel uncomfortable. At a time when many shows still leaned into spectacle, this level of restraint felt almost alien, too slow, too quiet, too grounded. And because of that, it didn't capture mass attention the way more visually striking series did. But over time, its identity has only grown stronger. Because it wasn't trying to impress, it was trying to immerse. To create a world that feels real enough to exist beyond the screen, and once you step into it, it's hard to leave. Not because it's exciting, but because it feels inevitable. Zeta Gundam. A New Translation, 2008. A bold attempt to reimagine one of the most iconic mecha stories in history, Zeta Gundam. A new translation never truly found the audience it deserved. Unlike the original 1985 series, this recut version restructured the narrative, focusing more intensely on the emotional undercurrents and complex character arcs that made the original so beloved. While many fans of the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise eagerly anticipated its release, the film failed to connect in the way its predecessors did. Perhaps it was the unexpected approach to the storytelling or the way the iconic characters evolved under a new light. Zeta Gundam was always known for its darker themes, war-torn despair, and shifting alliances. But the reinterpretation proved to be a double-edged sword. For some, it was an exciting exploration of an established classic. For others, it felt like an unnecessary departure from what made Zeta Gundam resonate in the first place. It was a show caught in a nostalgic tug-of-war, appealing only to a niche group of hardcore fans who could look past the shifts in tone and narrative. The story of a war without clear heroes or villains, exploring the consequences of conflict and betrayal, was always ahead of its time. And yet, this reimagining, while beautifully crafted, couldn't bridge the gap between legacy and innovation. Aura Battler, Dunbine, 1983. It takes the idea of mecha and moves it somewhere completely unexpected. Dunbine doesn't exist in space or on a futuristic Earth. It exists in a world that feels closer to fantasy, filled with strange creatures, unfamiliar landscapes, and a logic that doesn't follow traditional science fiction rules. And within that world, the machines feel almost alive, not mechanical in the usual sense, but organic, integrated into the environment rather than imposed on it. That shift changes the entire tone. Battles don't feel technological, they feel mythical. And the characters, pulled from one world into another, carry a constant sense of disorientation. They don't belong here. They're trying to adapt to something that doesn't fully make sense. That feeling of displacement runs through the entire series. It creates tension, but not the kind audiences were used to. It's quieter, more internal, and as the story progresses, it becomes increasingly complex morally, emotionally, narratively. There are no simple sides, no clear resolutions, just consequences that continue to unfold. At the time, this approach was difficult to process. It didn't offer comfort. It didn't provide easy answers. And because of that, it struggled to maintain a wide audience. But today, it stands as one of the most unique interpretations of the genre. Not because it followed the rules, but because it rewrote them entirely. Blue Gale Xabungle, 1982. It breaks the tone before the story even begins. Xabungle doesn't ask you to take it seriously, and that's exactly why it becomes so effective. In a genre often defined by intensity and drama, this series leans into humor, absurdity, and unpredictability. Characters react in exaggerated ways, situations escalate without warning, and the world itself feels chaotic, almost unstable. But beneath that chaos is something carefully constructed. The setting, a harsh, resource-driven environment, creates constant pressure. Survival isn't guaranteed. Systems aren't fair. And even as the series plays with tone, those realities never fully disappear. That contrast is what makes it work. The humor doesn't erase the stakes, it reframes them. It allows the story to explore serious ideas without becoming overwhelming. And in doing so, it creates a rhythm that feels completely different from its contemporaries. At the time, that difference was confusing. It didn't match expectations. It didn't fit the image of what a mecha show was supposed to be. So it was often dismissed as strange, inconsistent, even unfocused. But that unpredictability is exactly what gives Xabungle its identity. It refuses to stay in one place. It constantly shifts, constantly challenges what the viewer expects next. And in that constant movement, it becomes something rare, something that feels alive, unpredictable, and impossible to fully categorize, even decades later. These weren't the mecha giants that dominated headlines. They were the strange ones, the risky ones, the ones that slipped through the cracks while bigger names took the spotlight. But forgotten doesn't mean unimportant. Because sometimes the shows that vanish first are the ones that dared the most, and decades later, they still have the power to surprise you.